Evening all. We'll just give a couple of minutes for some of the other attendees to come onto the webinar. Thanks. Okay, we'll make a start. Firstly, I want to thank all of you for taking the time out to attend this webinar on the topic of hand-arm vibration. I'm Satish Lakiani, a consultant for SL Acoustics. I've been an independent consultant for the last 3 years, specializing in noise and vibration. And prior to that, I had been employed in industry for over a 20-year period, where I started off as an acoustic engineer and then became a consultant. Now, as far as tonight is concerned, as we go along, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat area, and I'll try to answer them as best as possible. But there will be a dedicated question and answer session at the end of the webinar. Now, just out of interest, for those of you who have tuned in, I was just wondering if you can just type in where you're watching it from, which part of the UK, or even abroad, if you're watching it from abroad. I'd be pretty grateful to get the this interests me really, so just out of interest. Okay, let's make a start now. I saw this on HSC website a few months ago, and just take a few seconds to read it, please. Thank you. Okay, now clearly that has not happened. So what I did then, I went on to social media across a couple of platforms, and I put this quote there, and also I asked the question, why do you still think that hand-arm vibration syndrome still exists in the workplace? And the responses on both these polls, in first, second, and third place, were the same. Basically, the lack of awareness of the injury or the lack of awareness of HAVs. Then in second place, we had there were no controls that were implemented, or if controls were implemented, they were pretty ineffective. Then in third place, we had the fact that there were no risk assessments that were conducted, or if risk assessments were conducted, then they were to a poor standard. So I thought, well, let me try and address these three issues by way of a webinar, so that I'll give people a bit more confidence in trying to approach this issue in their workplace. So we've got these three. We're going to cover these three poll items tonight. Plus, we got other things that we're going to cover tonight, which will increase your knowledge of the subject of hand-arm vibration. So here's what we've planned for tonight. Awareness to hand-arm vibration, and I'll show you evidence that it is still an issue that's in the workplace. Then, are there any risks of HAVs injuries occurring in your workplace? How to spot, how to spot the risks of this injury actually taking place. then what's the relevant legislation, or what's the applicable legislation with respect to hand-arm vibration? And how do you go about carrying out a risk assessment if you're spotted that there are risks in your workplace? And in the process of carrying out a risk assessment, what sort of things should you look out for? Because if you're not aware of these things, you may, and your risk assessment may end up being null and void, and indeed you could be underestimating the risks to your employees. Then once you have carried out your risk assessments, what examples of controls could you implement so that you end up complying with the regulations and also preventing injury? Then what happens if injury does strike in your workplace? What are the consequences to your business? And what sort of protection methods should you implement in your workplace so that you're confident of defending successfully against any HAVs claims cases, or indeed discouraging baseless ones, and also avoiding HSE intervention? So we've got quite a few things to cover tonight. Well, let's start off with hand-arm vibration syndrome first. What is it? It's actually an overarching term that's given to the injury of the hand and arm that arises when vibration equipment is used, or vibration is equipment, for uncontrolled use of vibration equipment and from material held against the vibration equipment. It comes in three forms, or rather three independent components. The first of which is it's a vascular component, where it's related to damage of the blood vessels in the hands and the fingers. And this is the symptoms, as many of you are probably familiar with, show up as finger blanching. And this is actually, this is an injury that's visible to anybody overlooking this injury. The second component is a neurological component, where it's damage to nerves of the hand and fingers. And the symptom of this is the loss of feeling and the loss of manual dexterity. This is quite something that is obvious to an onlooker. And therefore, this is, in my experience, this is not really recognized as a form of hand-arm vibration injury because of the fact that it's not so easily seen by an overlooker. Then in third place, you have the musculoskeletal component, which the symptoms of which are weakness of grip, pain in the wrist joint, and quite often this is associated with carpal tunnel syndrome through use of, or excessive use of, power tools. Now, you must be aware that certainly the first two components, that's the vascular and the neurological ones, beyond a certain stage, they become irreversible and disabling, or possibly disabling. And if in effect, prevention really is the only cure. So how would a hand-arm vibration syndrome, how would this injury affect family life, or how would it affect an individual's life? Well, take, for instance, family life. I think if you can see from that image there, you can get an idea of how it can affect family life. And when it comes to the individual, there's various ways by which it affects his life, and it's things that we take for granted. Normal day-to-day activities are quite disrupted. For instance, difficulty in fastening and unfastening buttons, not being able to use cutlery normally, participating in outdoor activities such as fishing, watching football matches. Even the ability to operate a smartphone effectively is a bit of a struggle. Likewise, for holding a glass steadily. And I'll leave your imagination to the last one over there. So here's evidence to show that hand-arm vibration injuries are still kicking around in the workplace. Between 2014 and 2018, nearly 50% of RIDDORs reported were hand-arm vibration related. Now, that may be a few years ago, but that figure has not been reduced to a figure that we can consider to be insignificant today. Here's more evidence that hand-arm vibration still exists in the workplace. You may have seen some of these headlines over the last few years, and most of these injuries, if not all of them, or most of these prosecutions happened from 2016 onwards. Now, many of you may know that in 2016, we had the Sentencing Council guidelines that took prosecutions to a new level. So one of the ways by which businesses were prosecuted or fined depended to a large extent on the turnover of the business. So effectively, the bigger they are, the harder they could fall. When are we going to hit 7 figures? Who knows? It's also worth noting that from the Sentencing Council guidelines, one of the ways by which business can be prosecuted is not just risk, not just injury taking place, but the risk of injury taking place. So in theory, you can be prosecuted if there is a risk of injury taking place. So which are the risky industries? Some of you tuning in tonight may be associated with some of these industries, and this is by no means an exclusive list. So maybe you're able to identify your industries here. If you are, just notify which industry you represent if you're on this webinar. And then which are the tools that do provide risks in the workplace. Now, these are the tools, if used for these periods of time, may be a risk, or there's a certain risk of the injury happening in your workplace. Now, this is very much a rule of thumb, this table, but if you're using these tools, certainly for these periods of time, then yes, you could consider that there is a risk of injury happening in your workplace. Now, bear in mind that the risk will increase if these tools are used in succession during the day. So that's something you have to be aware of. What other further risks are there from hand-arm vibration? What are the things that you need to look out for in addition to that table I just showed you in the previous page? We'll ask your employees, or if you haven't already, 15 to 20 minutes after they use power tools, do they show signs of tingly fingers? And if that's the case, and they do, then that's a sign that they may have the very first symptoms of injury. So you need to look into this a bit more seriously. In fact, the HSE would reckon this to be a matter of evident concern if they answered yes to this. If they answered yes to this question. Yes, those fines, Mr. Kinderman, those fines before 2016, from what I remember, I don't remember there being so many six-figure fines when it came to HAV's prosecutions. I certainly remember 5-figure fines, but not so many 6-figure fines. But if anybody on this webinar can, correct me or let me know, I'd appreciate that. The other thing to look out for is that further risks to be aware of is that if there are any particular tools used, say, for significantly long periods of time during the day, then that may be considered to be a risk, because as I'll explain to you, the risk not only depends on the vibration level of the tool, but how long the tool is used for. So if there's any tools that are used for long periods of the day, that should be considered to be a risk as well. If further are the risks that you need to look out for, or evidence that there are risks, if these may not necessarily be directly related to the vibration exposure, but the conditions they work in. So if your employees work in cold conditions, say in unheated environments, indoors and outdoors, say utility workers or construction workers, then they, or even ground staff workers, they may be particularly at risk, because under these conditions, the blood circulation slows down, and when the blood circulation slows down, it makes one more vulnerable to HAVs-like injuries. And what if your employees are adopting awkward postures when using power tools in your workplace? For instance, look for signs where the wrists are very much at non-neutral positions when operating power tools, because this may give rise to the musculoskeletal type injury, the carpal tunnel syndrome type of injuries. Now, this may be actually a hazard, because when the operative perhaps may have these musculoskeletal injuries, or like carpal tunnel syndrome, the grip strength is weakened, and with a grip strength, it may lead to a safety risk, not just for the operative, but for his colleagues working in close proximity to him. Take this into account. And what if your employees do show the early signs of HAVs injuries? Then they may be more vulnerable to the injury, or they could contract the injury a lot quicker than some of the other colleagues. So you have to look out. You have to look out. You have to look out for that as a large risk or big risk. What about the relevant legislation as far as hand-down vibration is concerned? Well, there is many of you may know the control of vibration at work regulations. This was actually introduced about 15 or 16 years ago, and for the sole purpose of protecting employees against the ill effects of hand-down vibration. Now, in there, it explains the duties of the employers, or what duties the employers have to protect the employees. And in there, there's also a couple of trigger levels, a couple of exposure values that they give. And I'll explain that later. And you have to see where your risks lie with respect to those exposure values. And then that would be how you determine the controls that you implement. We'll come to all of that later. By the way, this document is available on the HSE website, and it's downloadable for free in case you're not aware of it. Okay, now that from the first few slides, I've explained to you how do you determine whether there are risks of injuries happening in your workplace. If you found out, yes, there are risks that there may be HAVs may really be a serious issue in the workplace, then the next thing you look to do is carry out a risk assessment. Now, that's all outlined in the regulations. However, I'll just list what's needed to carry out basically a competent risk assessment. Find out who may be at risk from hand-down vibration. Then you have to assess the risk by quantifying the risk, and I'll come to that later, from those who are using power tools. But once you've quantified that risk, you have to compare the outcome of that against the limits in the regulations, which I was telling you about, which are the exposure values. We'll come to that later. Then once you have done the comparison then against the limits in the regulations, next you have to determine what your action plans are. In other words, what controls to the risks you should implement so that you reduce the risks to as low as reasonably practicable, quite often known as ALARP. You also have to identify those employees or groups of employees who may be particularly at risk from the vibration. And these ones, if you cast your mind back to a few slides earlier, these may be the ones who have already got signs of HAVs injuries. There may be ones who are perhaps working in the outdoor environments, or rather in cold environments. They may be at particular risk from injuries. And those who adopt awkward postures, again, they may be at risk from injuries. So you need to manage, or you need to rather identify those groups of workers or the individuals, and because they require special management. And once you have implemented your controls, what have you got in place to ensure that your controls remain effective moving forward? Excuse me. Now, I've put this last sentence in there because I've had experience in the past where I've carried out risk assessments for organizations, and unfortunately, they don't seem to have done, or rather, they didn't do much with the risk assessment. Rather, they filed it in a drawer only to sleep with the mushrooms. Really and truly, if the HSE do find that out, then they really wouldn't think highly of you. So once you've carried out your risk assessments, I really urge you to implement the controls as soon as you possibly can. Also, the other thing is that with a risk assessment, it is a legal requirement to impart the information from the risk assessment to explain to employees what the outcome of the risk assessment was. Okay, quantifying the risk. How do you go about doing that? I've talked a lot about that. Well, by definition, the quantification of the risk is known as the daily exposure. And the daily exposure is also known as the A8. That's explained in the regulations, but I'll give you a bit more about it. What is the daily exposure? Well, it's actually made up, there's two quantities that make up the daily exposure. There's the vibration level of the tool and how long the tool is used for. So if you're looking to evaluate the daily exposure, then what you'll need to do is find that vibration, get a representative vibration level of the tool, and also the exposure time or the operating time of the tool. So let's concentrate on the vibration level of the tool. How do you get the vibration level of the tool? You can go online. There's some databases online. You can get the information from these databases. However, be very careful. If you're looking to get this vibration data from the databases, or the vibration levels from the databases, I would suggest that you try and get it from at least 2 independent sources, because then if you get them and the levels tie up, then you're quite confident that you can use that for your risk assessment. Or the HSE have got a table of indicative vibration magnitudes on their website, which is certainly good enough to use for an initial risk assessment. Yes, Kinderman, we just come away from the webinar for the time being. Kinderman has asked the question, does the risk assessment need reviewing in future? Yes, if it certainly will, and that's something maybe I should have included in the slides, where if the operations change, in other words, if there's a change in the way you do your work processes, and you consider that that might affect exposures or might affect the conditions, then yes, you should be reviewing your risk assessment when that happens. And really and truly, I mean, every few years, it's good practice to review your risk assessment. Thanks for that, Mr. Kinderman. Okay, tool vibration levels. So we had databases online, and also the HSE information. Another way of determining the tool vibration level is to actually carry out a measurement. Now, if you're not happy with those, what you get online, then yes, you can carry out your measurement. This has got the advantage that is the measurement of your tool as used in your environment, using your work processes, and it's quite specific to you and may be very relevant for your risk assessment. Or perhaps you may be using the tools differently or in a way that's probably unique to you. So maybe that would justify you carrying out a measurement on the tool. However, if you're carrying out the measurements in your workplace, be aware that whoever is doing the measurement must be competent enough to carry out the measurement, and they must be familiar with this ISO standard here, which I'm just going to point my mouse to. ISO standard here, 5349-2, because that gives guidance on how to carry out the measurements in the workplace. And this standard is referred to in the regulations. The reason why this is important is because this guidance explains a strategy to adopt if you're measuring different types of vibration tools. And also in there, it explains or it gives guidance on how to attach the sensor to the tool when you're doing the measurement, because that is very critical. If you have attached the sensor incorrectly to the tool, you may get vibration readings that are invalid, and you could end up invalidating your risk assessment. So whoever is carrying out the measurement must be competent enough and must be familiar with this ISO standard. And as I said, this ISO standard is referred to in the vibration regulations. Likewise, the measuring kit that is used for measuring the vibration levels must conform to this ISO 8041 standard, which is also in the vibration regulations. Now, the reason why I put this statement here is because last year I had an organization that approached me asking me to sanitize their vibration results. When I looked deeper into it, and when I drilled down, no pun intended, I found out that the vibration levels really didn't seem to make much sense. And then after looking into it even more, it turns out that they were using equipment that did not conform to ISO 8041, the ISO 8041 standard. Rather, they used equipment which was to measure vibration of machinery for machinery conditioning. So that made their results pretty nonsensical, and I had to go in there and carry out their measurements with using the proper equipment and also using the right guidance. Now, 8041 is also referred to in the vibration regulations, but unlike this standard, you really don't have to know the guts of ISO 8041. Just be satisfied or just ensure that the vibration measuring equipment does conform to this 8041 standard. Okay, I've got to put in a word of warning over here. Manufacturer's data. I would very much recommend that you refrain from using manufacturer's vibration data for the purpose of your risk assessment. Now, manufacturers do have to declare a vibration reader or vibration result or vibration value with their equipment that they put into the marketplace. However, the way they actually get this result is that the measurement is that they do conduct the measurements in accordance with an international standard. And they conduct it in a lab environment on new tools with new consumables. So it's a very sterile environment, unlike the real workplace. In fact, the real workplace is a more harsher environment. So the vibration results in the real workplace are bound to be, and are more often, much higher than or higher than the vibration levels that the manufacturer declares. So be very careful, or at least check with the manufacturers first. But if you use this vibration data blindfoldedly, you could very well be underestimating the risks. Now, there is a reason why they declare such vibration levels is because at least purchasers, when they or customers can make an informed decision when they look to acquiring these tools and make a judgment through the vibration levels. I did on a social media platform, and I asked the question: if you were carrying out a risk assessment and you require the vibration levels of a tool, where would you get the vibration levels of a tool? And over 54% or 54% said they'd use the manufacturer's data. I do hope they consulted with the manufacturer first. Okay, if there's been a bit of controversy in the world of hand-arm vibration, then this is it. Because there are some equipment suppliers who provide measuring equipment that measure vibration levels where the sensor is mounted on the operative's wrist whilst he's operating the tools, and the measuring sensor is mounted in a glove which the operative wears as he's using the tools. And this has actually made the ASC put out a statement in one of their online vibration documents, and I'll just take out some extract from that statement and flash it up on the screen. They reckon that these measurement methods, where these transducers are wrist-mounted or glove-mounted, or the sensors are wrist-mounted and glove-mounted, when they make measurements, these measurements are unlikely to be reliable. Then they go on to say that these sensors or transducers must be firmly attached to the vibrating surface of the tool, or vibrating surface of the tool, or on the material held against the tool. Then they make a fairly clear-cut statement here that these measurement methods are certainly not valid for a risk assessment, and they make reference to that ISO standard I was telling you about. So really, what they're saying is fairly clear and obvious. So beware of such equipment. We've got the vibration level of the tool. Next, it's the exposure time that we're looking for. How do we get the exposure time? Well, the exposure time, what we do is we can ask the operatives, but be very careful, because you have to make it clear to them that it is the trigger time you want, the actual operating time of the tool, because sometimes what they may equate that to is the time taken to complete the task, which very often is a lot longer than the trigger time. So if you take that information without making it clear to them, you run the risk of overestimating the risk. You could go and time the process yourself using a stopwatch, or maybe a tool timer, or it depends on the nature of your business. If you're a business that manufactures items, what you could do is that you could look at the time taken for a power tool to work on one of those items. Say if you're linishing a component, how long it takes to linish one component. Then look at the batch and see how many components the operative has completed. And from that, then you can determine the total exposure time from that operation. Or in the case of a garage, a motor vehicle garage, a repair garage, see how long, or measure how long it takes for an operative to use an impact wrench to carry out wheel changes. And once you've done that, look at his job record at the end of the day, see how many wheel changes he's done, and then from that you can extract the exposure time as a result of using the tool. So what happens when you get the vibration information and the exposure time? Well, the next thing to do is you could go on the HSE website. They've got a great spreadsheet on their website where you could process these results. Now, it's so simple that even I can use it. So basically what you do is you go in there, you put in your vibration level of the tool in one of the cells, and then in another one, you put in the exposure time. And as if by magic, it works out the exposure in terms of exposure points. Now, the whole thing is explained in the on the HSE website and in the regulations. So I won't go into depth in that here, but I would suggest that you work in terms of exposure points because that's so much simpler. You can add them, you can subtract them. So keep to working in exposure times for simplicity. Now, one beauty about this HSE spreadsheet is that if the operative is using tools successively in the day, for each tool, providing the vibration level of the tool and the exposure time of the tool, it can work out the exposure points. And for all the tools during the day you use during the day, you just add up these exposure points, and this cell is the important one. It gives you the total exposure points for the day. So make note of what you get in this cell, and also make note of this cell beneath it, because that also will help you. That also gives a bit of information for you. Next, you've got the daily exposure points, right? How do you use it? Well, if you remember, I was telling you earlier about when I explained to you about the regulations. In the regulations, they have what they call one of the exposure values is the exposure limit value, which is equivalent to 400 exposure points. So if that daily exposure points you've worked out is potentially or it's likely to be above 400 exposure points, or even above 400 exposure points, your duty as an employer is to ensure that you reduce these exposure points below the limit and make sure it doesn't happen again. That's a legal requirement. So effectively, the employee cannot work at these exposure point conditions. Now, what happens if there's the other exposure value, which is the exposure action value, which is equivalent to 100 exposure points. So if your daily exposure that you worked out in the spreadsheet is potentially likely to exceed 100 exposure points, or indeed exceeds 100 exposure points, your duty as an employer is to ensure that you try to eliminate this exposure or eliminate the risk, or reduce it to as low as reasonably practicable. Now, if you cannot do that, then you are required to provide health surveillance to your employees, and also information, instruction, and training to your employees. And for instance, in the training, you should include some material, or you're recommended to include material like awareness to HAVs. Now, I've got a guide on hand-arm vibration information, instruction, and training, which is a freebie. I can send it out to you guys. So if you actually do want it, what I'll do is I'll put my email address in the message box, and then you actually can send me an email requesting that guide, and I'll just send it off to you in a few days. So here we go. See if I can type my email correctly. I think that's it. Yeah, so if you want that guide, just ping me an email and I shall send you that guide, no obligations. Right, okay, let's see where we are. Let's just get back. Yes, okay. If you remember one of those early slides, I was talking to you about those who may be particularly vulnerable or particularly at risk of a hand-arm vibration syndrome. Well, those groups of workers or those individuals, they must be provided with health surveillance and information instruction and training, even though their exposures are below 100 exposure points. So this is a legal requirement that you must fulfill. Okay, if you have been asleep up until now, can I just ask you to awaken for the next 3 or 4 slides, because these, as far as I'm concerned, are the 3 or 4 of the most important slides in the slide deck. Now, just to let you know that SL Acoustics don't offer health surveillance as part of its services. But when it comes to health surveillance, if you're a business that's associated in any way with hand-down vibration and you don't have health surveillance, my recommendation is that you get in health surveillance. Because let's say that you've implemented control methods to control the risks, which you think may be effective. Health surveillance will prove that, because if you carry out health surveillance as a result of, or if you've got a control methods and you carry out health surveillance and there are no issues, you must be doing something right. So health surveillance is a very good way to determine whether your control methods are working or not. And if there are injuries in your organization that you may not be aware of, or your employees may not be aware of, if you get in health surveillance, if you haven't got it, health surveillance will detect such injuries, and they will be able to advise you on how to manage those affected so that you can prevent these injuries from getting worse. And then baselining. If you've got new employees join, it's a good idea to let them go through pre-employment screening, and then so that you can monitor their health as through the employment with your organization. And I can assure you this will come in extremely useful if you have to face litigation or court appearances. PPE. Well, I've got some bad news for you. If you think that if you're using PPE, then you think that that's working, because PPE is regarded to be ineffective. It's not a way of protecting your employees against HAVs injuries. In fact, if you look at those gloves there, you will need something a bit more considerable than that. In fact, you will need something about 3 or 4 times the size of this to be able to have any chance of protecting your employees. So obviously that's going to be a waste of time. So if I were you, I would just knock PPE on the head, as it's not a valid way of protecting your employees. Any business that's associated with hand-down vibration, it is your duty as an employer to ensure that you try to eliminate the risk, or you eliminate the risk, do your best to eliminate the risk, and if not, to reduce it to as low as reasonably practicable. That should be the first and foremost thing to any business where hand-down vibration does exist. Now, this is actually a legal requirement, and it should be an ongoing process, and you should document this process. So that's the situation with elimination and reducing to as low as reasonably practicable. Now, what if, when you've decided that your risks are high enough to implement controls, what sort of controls to implement and in what order? Now, many of you are from health and safety backgrounds, so you should realize this inverted triangle, especially from other areas of health and safety. Hand-down vibration is no different. So the first thing you have to try and do, or ask yourself, is this process actually necessary? Do we really have to carry the process out? If you have to carry the process out, then is there a way by which we can separate the operative from the source? In other words, some sort of automation or substitution, or perhaps mechanization. If you can't, then what about an engineering form of control to reduce the risk? In other words, what about safe selection of safe tools, or even modifying the tools, or by use of jigs, etc.? Next in priority is any administrative controls. Can you implement any administrative controls by way of safety procedures, e.g. job sharing, or perhaps even labeling tools, depending on how risky the tools are? And PPE, but I've crossed that out. So that actually is not an option that you should look at. Here's examples of substitution. Many of you in various sectors of industry may recognize this. And what's happened is, or mechanization. what's happened here is that you've virtually reduced the risk to zero, certainly the risk of hand-arm vibration. So these are good examples of substitution and or mechanization. Then here's the engineering controls, where you look to safer tools to use. Now with better and better technology, manufacturers are trying to implement low vibration mechanisms in such equipment, which makes the tools safer to use. Then here we have the administrative methods. As we said, job rotation. This may not be suitable to many organizations, particularly small ones, because they don't have the luxury of the high numbers of staff or staff that may be multi-skilled. I have to tell you something about job rotation. It's not the most efficient way of reducing exposure. In fact, if you want to reduce exposure, say by 50% or reduce the risk by 50%, you're better off trying to reduce the vibration level by 50%. So that way you halve the risk, or you reduce the exposure by 50%. But if you want to reduce the risk by 50%, you will have to reduce the exposure time by 75%. So it's not the most efficient way of reducing exposure, job rotation, but it's still a way by which you can reduce exposures. There's other ways by which you can reduce risks. Use the right tool for the right job. It might not necessarily affect the exposure, but what it does do is that it minimizes the chance of, say, musculoskeletal injuries using the right tool with the right ergonomics. So consider that as a method of control as well to reduce the risks. There may be tools that your operatives require training to use these tools. You'll have to ask your suppliers about that, because they may be trained to use the tools in an efficient manner, in a safe manner. And quite often when they use these tools, when they're trained to use these tools, what happens is that if they're trained to use the tools correctly, it may involve using the tools so that they minimize the transfer of vibration from the tools into the body, which lowers the risk. So find out from your equipment suppliers whether such training is available for certain tools. Oops. And when it comes to acquiring tools, you have to re-examine your purchase policy. Look to buy low vibration, but don't just look at low vibration. Look at other things like efficiency, how the tool handles, the ergonomics of the tools. In fact, when you're going through a program of acquiring tools, my recommendation would be to get your employees to trial the tools, trial the low vibration tools, and then agree to down select the kind of tools that make the work more efficient and that they're happy to use. And then you approach your purchasing department to either hire the tools in or to buy the tools in. Let it be done that way rather than let it be done through the purchasing route, where purchase have the first decision. Get your operatives to have an influence in that. There's other ways by which you can reduce risks, more methods. Maintaining the tools, this is a best practice method you can, or procedure that you can implement in your organization, a safe system of work where the tools are serviced regularly in line with manufacturer's recommendations, or if the tools are damaged, make sure that they're repaired or replaced in a timely manner, because tools that are damaged or not serviced tend to give off more vibration and noise for that matter. And also ensure that the consumables are replaced in a timely manner when they're worn out, because that allows for safe operation of the tool. Earlier, I was telling you about operatives working in cold conditions where they may be more vulnerable to HAVs. If operatives do work under these sort of conditions, then just look to provide them with warm clothing and gloves so that they keep warm and dry, and they minimize the chances, or they become less vulnerable to hand-arm vibration injuries. Another one is discouraging smoking. There's not many that know that smoking actually can increase the chances of HAVs. The reason why is that the nicotine in the cigarettes tend to get introduced into the bloodstream, and when nicotine into the bloodstream, that slows down blood circulation. So if your employees are smoking in breaks, in between using power tools, discourage them from smoking, because like I said, that will encourage HAVs. I'm sure it'll be good on their wallets as well. Now, according to insurance companies, any businesses that are associated with hand down vibration, they run the risk of being hit with civil claims. Now, you have to consider civil claims are so much more easier to launch now. Think no win, no fee. It becomes so much easier for a claimant to just click a mouse button or also pick up a phone call. So be very wary that this could hit you at any time. So you have to protect your business against this sort of thing. What happens if you're unfortunate enough to be hit by a civil claim? Well, or you have to settle a civil claim outside of court. Well, your insurance will pay the claim, or more than likely pay the claim or the settlement. Fine, that's what you pay your insurance for. But just be very careful, because the HSE conducted research and they found out that for every £1 paid out in a claim, it'll cost the business between 8 to 36 times of that claim. And these uninsured costs, what do they consist of? Well, I've put a few of them up there. Obviously, your insurance premiums could go up. You've got to pay an insurance excess. What else? There's retrain the staff, replacement staff to replace the absent staff, court costs. You've got to foot all of that. So I went ahead and asked someone in insurance organization, what is a typical HAVs claim a typical HAVs claim that's paid out? And he said, if you're 10 to 15K, give 10 to 15K, you wouldn't be too far out with that. So now, bearing in mind what the HSE researched, that would it would be possible that the organization, after paying a 10 to 15K claim, it could end up costing the organization anywhere between 80K to over £500,000. So just let that sink in. As if you thought that was enough, there's other consequences to the organization if they get hit by such claims. One of them is reputational damage. I mean, this consequence can effectively affect your bottom line. There may be other businesses or organizations that would want to do business with you, particularly if they are very keen on doing business with companies that have good health and safety records, for instance, government agencies. So you could lose out there. And then what happens with good employees? If you disrespect their health and safety, they may just up sticks and go. And likewise, you may find it difficult to recruit good employees. So that will, at some stage, affect your bottom line. Morale isn't exactly going to be sky high with all these issues in your organization. So that's going to affect productivity, affecting your bottom line. But despite all of this, it really is your moral responsibility to look after the employee's health and safety, because there's no reason why he should come into work or leave work any less healthier than he comes into work. And you saw earlier what the consequences could be to him and his family. So I want you to ask yourself these questions. I'm just going to flash them up on the screen, and just ask yourself these questions and whether you've got these in your workplace or implemented in your workplace. And if the answer is no, this could be the consequences. And if the answer is fortunate enough to be the answer to be yes to these questions, make sure that everything is documented, because if you do have to appear in court or answer to the HSE, if you've got no documented evidence, then you haven't got a leg to stand on. Right, okay, we've come to the end. Just a quick summary on what we've covered over the webinar. We've shown you that 15 years of legislation, HAVs is still an issue. Now you should be aware of the signs of HAVs, and you should be aware of the signs of HAVs. So when you go into your business tomorrow, you should be able to find out. And also, you should also be able to identify the risks of HAVs in your workplace from the information I've provided you. Once there are risks in your workplace, you should be able to carry out a competent risk assessment, or be aware of what a competent risk assessment looks like, and be aware of what things to look out for. Because if you don't look out for those things, you may end up with a risk assessment that is invalid, and indeed perhaps underestimating the risks to your employees. What sort of you've got an idea of the kind of controls to implement in the right order, so that you prevent against injury and comply with the regulations. And what are the consequences to your organization, or what possible consequences there could be to your business if you get HAVs injuries, or if workers contract HAVs injuries, and what you need to put into place so that you can minimize the chance of litigation. In other words, defend successfully against litigation and discourage baseless claims, and how to avoid HSE intervention. And with that, I end. Now, just before we go on to questions, I just want to say a couple of things. This is the email, so if you wish to, if you request one of those, the guide on information, instruction, and training, just send me a request, and I will ping the guide over to you free of charge, of course. And the other thing is that I'll probably want to, in fact, I will want to send a feedback form to you on what you thought of the webinar. So I'll look to send it to you. Now, some of you have given me, when you registered, you gave me private email addresses. So I'm just a bit wary about GDPR. So if you have any issues with me emailing you those, the webinar, or the survey sheet or feedback sheet, then just please type it in here. Otherwise, I'll look to many of you maybe connected with me on LinkedIn, and I'll look to send it on LinkedIn via an attachment. If some of you are not connected with me on LinkedIn, then just please do connect with me on LinkedIn, and I can send you that document as well. I think that is it. Yes, so we'll have questions then. Have any questions? Thank you. Okay, looks like no questions been there. I hope you've all found it interesting, and there were some takeaways. So I look forward. I'm looking to have such webinars in future. I just want to thank you for taking the time out to attend this webinar, particularly this time of the year. You could have had other things to do, but thank you very much anyway. And I wish you all a very happy Christmas and New Year. Thank you. Good night.